So without further ado, I'll hand it over to George to get us started. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Julie. So good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this 5th edition of Space Tech by MIT AeroAstro. So this year's theme, may I have, Emilia, may I have the slides, please? Emilia, may I have the slides, please? Yeah, so this year's theme is From the Earth to the Moon, and we chose it for a few reasons. First, humanity is returning to the moon in the next few years. Now, MIT went to the moon the first time round with astronauts, with the Apollo guidance computer, and with more. And MIT is going again with the efforts of researchers and students and alumni who have been sending landers, rovers, and experiments. Some have just been there, and some are on their way. And so we are very excited for the return to the moon and for MIT's part on that. But there is a second reason. We were not first with the name From the Earth to the Moon. We pay homage to Jules Verne, right, whose novel inspired me as a child, and I am sure many others, to pursue our dreams of space. So as Julie said, today is a celebration of our continued role in space here at MIT. And this year's edition of Space Tech was designed to shine a spotlight on the work done by talented students, researchers, and alumni. Now, according to US News and World Report, AeroAstro is the #1 program for graduate and aerospace and undergraduate aerospace engineering for more than a decade. So we look forward to seeing and hearing what is next in space through their cutting-edge work. So let's see, I can change with this one, right? Great. So throughout the program today, we will have student lightning talks. And when you see this QR code, please take out your device and scan the code so you can participate in the voting. If you want, you can do it now and have the application up. The audience will choose the best speaker and the runners-up, and they'll receive a prize from our department. We are very grateful to our event sponsors, Aerospace Corporation and ANSYS, the makers of STK, for supporting our event. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Julien Lamamy. Julien has a master's and a PhD from AeroAstro Space Systems Lab, and he is currently the managing director of iSpace Europe. We're very excited and honored to have you back with us today. And the floor is yours.
Cool. Thank you, George. Yeah, so it's almost 20 years since I left MIT after my PhD. So it's very emotional for me to be back here today and on the other side. When I approached this talk, and as the first talk of the day, I thought it'd be interesting to try to make it useful for the students in the room today in 3 ways. Share the excitement, and Julie mentioned it's a very exciting time. So what is the excitement around lunar activities? Why am I so excited about the moon? Tell you about iSpace, the company I work for, which may not be as well known as other companies here in the US. Trying to convince you to join us. And also share some thoughts about how you should approach maybe your career. You're about to join the professional world, what to think about, and especially if you're considering joining space exploration, lunar exploration, either in a space agency or private company. So that's a bit the thread for today. This is a picture of Antoine, one of our engineers in Luxembourg, looking at our flight model of the rover, which he designed the structure for, attached to our lander, the iSpace lander, that was taken maybe August of last year. The 2 spacecraft, the rover and the lander, are currently on their way to the moon, and I'll tell that story right now. So this could be you in a few months, a couple of years. Let's see, how does that work? Okay. So I don't have the previous slides, but I hope the content will make up for that. This is a slide I use when I onboard engineers and employees at iSpace Europe for several reasons. I want to show the timeline also of where I came from, how I came to iSpace, and also what are the several milestones that led to why today is a super exciting time. It goes back pretty far, maybe for some of you, in 1997. What you see there as a GIF is the Sojourner rover. This was part of the Mars Pathfinder mission from NASA. First rover to ever land and operate on Mars. So it's not Moon, but it's still very relevant. This is there for several reasons. For me personally, this was my Apollo moment. When I saw this mission on TV on CNN, I was hooked. I was like, okay, this is it. This is what I want to do. And I'm very thankful that today we're about to do this exact same thing for the Moon. Second, I think this mission for me is new space before new space. This was the era of faster, better, cheaper at NASA. Back when exploration was pretty much NASA and NASA. A couple of agencies were doing space exploration, but Mars really was the field play of NASA. Space exploration was NASA. And they decided to do this thing of faster, better, cheaper. I think this rover was designed for maybe $20 million in 1997 dollars. So super cheap even for today. And so I think that's an anchor for what we're doing today on the Moon. Even though it's not a Mars rover, I think it carries the spirit and the mindset of how new space is approaching lunar exploration today. The next one is a document, Visions for Space Exploration. This was George W. Bush, 2004. Let's say the most recent initiative from a policy standpoint to reconnect with the Moon. There was a big gap between Apollo and I think the Visions for Space Exploration. The whole vision there was, okay, how do we approach the Moon and Mars together, go to both, think about an architecture that could work for both destinations. The cool thing is MIT was involved in this. We had a MIT Draper team, which was selected by NASA to think about, the system architecture. System of systems back then was the key word for this. And I was on the surface team on this for this MIT Draper initiative, which was really cool. I can't say in terms of milestones it led to anything significant from a new space exploration perspective, but it was still very important, I think, from a putting the Moon back in the picture. And it took more than 10 years for the Artemis program to come along in 2017, and then the Artemis Accords in 2020. So that's a bit the NASA world on the top. Below the line is a bit the more what's going on the commercial side of things. And the main milestone there is the Google Lunar X Prize, 2007. So that already is dating quite a long time back. Google Lunar X Prize built on the Ansari X Prize. So the first X Prize was trying to mimic what another prize, I forgot the name, for the Lindbergh transatlantic flight. They said, okay, we're going to create a prize for the first company privately funded that can take humans above the 100-kilometer line twice within a week, I think was the requirement. And that was done successfully in the early 2000s. So interestingly, Ansari X Prize was 1996, before Sojourner. So interesting timing there. And building on the success of the Ansari X Prize, which was completed fairly quickly, the X Prize Foundation engaged with Google and said, okay, let's think bigger now. Let's go to the Moon. And the Google Lunar X Prize was to be awarded to the first company who could land on the Moon and travel 500 meters on the surface. So pretty big jump from 100 kilometers now to go to 400,000 kilometers, plus another 500 meters on the surface. And I think the X Prize misjudged the scale of that challenge a little bit. Also, the scale of the prize, $30 million, proved to be a little small compared to what it takes to go to the Moon and develop a lander, develop a rover. But what's interesting is even though the X Prize, the Google Lunar X Prize was canceled in 2018, we had, in the wake of that, a number of lunar landers launching to space. First one, Space IL from Israel. Then that was 2019. 2022, iSpace, our company, our first launch. Last year, two companies, Intuitive Machines, Astrobotic, and just a few months ago, I think February or March of this year, we had 3 lunar landers on their way to the Moon, all manufactured by private companies, Firefly, Intuitive Machines, and iSpace, which is, I think if you were talking to somebody in 2007, it would have been probably unbelievable. And so, I mean, that's, to me, a key message, which I have on the next slide, is that XPRIZE is really the inception point for where we are today in terms of lunar exploration with a commercial initiative, private initiative. And Artemis program only came 10 years later. So definitely necessary, but the trigger, the spark was that Google Lunar XPRIZE. Space IL is still kind of going on today. I mean, iSpace came from the Google XPRIZE, Into the Machines as well, Astrobotic as well. So the players you see active today, were created in the wake of the Google Lunar XPRIZE. I think at the time there was maybe 100 companies that were created. Okay, now we're a lot less, but very successful in terms of impact. And then the bottom part of the slide is the rest of the world from a public agency perspective. You have 4 successful Changi landings. The first one in 2013, I believe. 2 attempts from the Indian Space Agency, the second one being successful, and also somewhat successful landing from JAXA. I just landed yesterday from Luxembourg, so I'm jet lagged, so I have all my keynotes, my key points written down so I don't forget them. But yeah, the key point from the previous slide is the XPRIZE. I think to me, this is really an interesting fact that we're here today thanks to that XPRIZE. And then thanks to the public support from the Artemis program following that. If you looked at the slide before, the Google Lunar XPRIZE, from the time of the start of the XPRIZE to the first successful landing of today, it's roughly 18 years. It feels like a long time, but if you look at the NZR XPRIZE start date to the first real launch with Richard Branson, it's 24 years for the space tourism to really be a commercial activity. So we have an XPRIZE that was not successful with a much harder challenge, I would say, to realize. That was, that only took 18 years to reach, commercial activity, as opposed to 24 for space tourism, which you could say should be maybe something easier to commercialize. So I think that's a very interesting point that makes me optimistic about the industry future. Then the other point is, if you looked at the landing attempts, you have equal number from public agencies and private companies, which is also, I think, a very healthy sign. And last one is, it's now a global activity. You saw 4 landing attempts from China, Israel, Japan. The first space company to launch was from Israel. The second one from Japan. It's no longer about U.S., Russia. Now it's really a global endeavor, which I think all these are very good signs for the future of the industry. So about iSpace. I have pictures of the team because I think this is really the most exciting thing about iSpace is the people we work with. We have 300 people. I think we're close to 30 nationalities. Even in Luxembourg, where there's only maybe like 45 of us, we still are very close to 30 nationalities. So very highly multicultural environment. The bottom picture is from Luxembourg, so I took a less, a more fun picture to show that we really value our diversity, cultural diversity, gender diversity. I think it's a big asset in terms of course, decision-making, but also just quality of life at iSpace. So we have entities in 3 continents. We're headquartered in Tokyo, but we have a big entity in Denver. I'm from Luxembourg. I manage a Luxembourg entity. We're the only lunar company with that setup. All the other lunar companies are mostly US-based and have an entity in the US. That's not true of Lunar Outpost, I think we're just talking later, which have also entities in Australia. But for like lunar lander companies, we're the only one. And to me, what's exciting is the reasons I joined iSpace 8 years ago, which is the longest I've worked anywhere, are still mostly true today. We're doing space exploration in a private environment. It used to be startup, now it's a bit more corporate. We're listed in Tokyo Stock Exchange. It's a very highly multicultural team environment. And our founder CEO, started this company 15 years ago. Still the same guy today. He's not a millionaire, he's not a billionaire. He's just a crazy guy with a big vision and an incredible amount of resilience. He started this by himself. First 5 years with pro bono people, and then slowly built this company into what we are today with two lunar landers, and being listed on Tokyo Stock Exchange. So we still had that feel at iSpace, I think, which is very unique, and I hope will entice you to dig a little more into iSpace and consider us for your next career. Luxembourg. Why Luxembourg? Maybe a surprise for some of you. Small country. We have 3 border countries: France, Germany, Belgium. 500,000 people. The size of the population almost doubles every day, with all the border workers coming to Luxembourg to work and coming back home in the evening. So if you don't like traffic, maybe you should reconsider Luxembourg. But for everything else, it's an amazing place to think about working or creating your company, doing business. For us, it all started in 2016 when the country decided to allocate $200 million on space resources. So 2016 is, Planetary Resources, eSpace Industries were the 2 companies bold enough to mention space resources as something that was a viable business model. And the nation decided to invest $200 million on it. So that was a crazy, bold move for a country to do. And I think the reason why we can now openly talk about space resources in a mainstream way is in large part thanks to Luxembourg and their vision. They did this because they wanted to diversify the economy, and they saw new space as a way to do this. We were part of the first companies to establish in Luxembourg with Planetary Resources, eSpace Industries. Today, I think there's maybe over 70 companies that have established in the past 8 years. There's a new space agency that was created in 2018, so only 2018. This was the Ministry of Economy before, so very pro-business. There's a Space Resource Center, so a center dedicated to the research on space resources, innovation. They've added an incubator, accelerator. So if your startup idea is related to space resources, you should definitely think about Luxembourg for that. And they've created the largest event on space resources that takes place every year. The next one is in May. It keeps growing and growing and growing. So again, I think thanks to Luxembourg's leadership there, new space resources are becoming mainstream, and especially in Europe. So the takeaway from this section is, I think, a big difference from when I left MIT in 2007 compared now is if you want to do space exploration, you don't have to compromise. You have your pick today. I mean, you're so lucky that say, okay, I can do space exploration with iSpace on the moon. I can work on a space data center on the moon. I can do space-based solar power from the moon. I mean, you can pick whatever topic you want. You'll find a startup somewhere that does this for the moon, Mars, or some other space exploration topic. You can do this outside the US today, which was not possible also when I started. And you can do this and still have a very fulfilling career. So I think that context for me is really amazing for all of you guys who will be starting very soon your careers. That really think outside the box, think global, and you don't have to compromise anymore. And the important point is this is not just for engineers. I mean, I think we have a lot of AeroAstro students here, but if you're a legal person, you can work on space resources regulations. If you're in the business side of things, lunar business is about as challenging as it gets. And so on and so on. So it's really an opportunity that's available to all disciplines. Quickly about our customers, because I think that's very important when we talk about an economy. You'll see that the tech for me comes last because that's almost the easy part. The tough part is get your startup funded for 15 years and then find customers, and then you can worry about the tech. So these are a few profiles I selected among our customers. Top left is a rover from the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center. So this is the space agency of Dubai. And they carry very much the faster, better, cheaper spirit of NASA of the 1990s. They did this rover, a bit like Sojourner. I think theirs is maybe 10 kilograms. I guess I was Sojourner too, yeah. 10 kilograms, and does some lunar science exploration. They flew on our M1 mission. And I think the cool thing to me with this agency is you have an emerging space agency doing traditional science. of course, for capacity building, national pride, and doing science and exploration. And basically, with iSpace, they were able to do this mission without having to rely on a collaboration with another agency to get that right, which means they could be the prime on the mission and then reach out to CNES and other space agencies for collaboration, but as the entity that was the leading agency for that mission, where typically if you're an emerging space agency, you're asking for favors from other, more mature space agencies to get a ride to the moon or a ride to Mars. And I think commercial transportation now enables emerging space agencies to have that leading role and engage on a more peer-to-peer basis with established space agencies. On top right, you have JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, and their payload on M1 was this Sora-Q rover. It's like a Pokemon rover. And the cool thing I find here is the parallel between the two, right? You have an established space agency now doing it more of a PR robotic experiment, and emerging space agency doing the more traditional science experiments. So there's things for everyone. Second row is 2 examples of just terrestrial companies from energy sector. Nitra wanted to test a solid-state battery. And then Takasago is currently flying on our M2 mission, and they will do electrolysis of water on the moon. This is their own investment. It's fully private. They're not getting any funding from any space agency. They decided to do this on their own, which I think shows that there's eagerness and engagement from the terrestrial industries to do things on the moon, and they see the opportunity to be first positioned or marketing, tech demos, and so on. And the last one, which is a bit close to my heart also because it's a rover payload that we integrated in Luxembourg, is the Moon House. So as the name explains, it's a house to go on the moon. For those of you who've been to Sweden, this is very much like a Swedish country house. That's the intent. And the artist behind this Moon House has been wanting to do this for, I think, 25 years or more. And couldn't find a way to, basically get his Moon House on the moon. So that's, I think, another interesting value point for companies like iSpace is that we can enable artists for not that much money to realize their dream, albeit in a very small scale. You'll see the Moon House is very small, but still, I think the symbolic impact is still there, and I'm really looking forward to having us deploy his Moon House on the moon, take the picture, and get that I think reaction from everyone and engagement. So the takeaways here, I think what's interesting is the healthy mix of public and private customers. It's not just, you realize I didn't even list NASA Eclipse, which is typically the primary customers for most transportation companies. We open access to multiple actors, emerging space agencies, but also entrepreneurs, artists. And there's an interesting engagement from the terrestrial industry. So I mean, it's weird to say terrestrial industry, but I think established companies that are not necessarily space companies, but see an opportunity to engage in space for their own business development. I think that's also a very healthy sign and positive sign for the future of the lunar sector. And again, global participation. We're talking Dubai. We have customers from Canada, Japan, Romania. So a positive sign. Quickly, so now the tech. I won't spend a lot of time on it because I can say the innovation is in the technology. I think the innovation for our products is in how to really integrate them as efficiently as possible, cost effectively as possible, and make them as small as possible. The lander on the left, is our lander that launched in 2022 and is currently on its way to the moon. It's about this size, very human scale, small technology demonstrator. Still carries payload that I mentioned earlier, developed in Japan. Interestingly, the first lander was developed in Japan, but assembled and tested in Germany, because that's where we could find the best place to do that, and then launched from the US. So it can also shows you the global supply chain there. Japan is working on the next generation one, and then in Denver, they're working also on the next generation, much larger one. And that lander will be used for the Draper iSpace mission CP-12 for the NASA Eclipse task order. And then very small on the right is what we do in Luxembourg, rovers. So our first one is about this size, Sojourner, and we're going to grow from there. But again, even for our rovers, the tech is really about making things as light as possible, not necessarily as smart as possible. Where we are today, roughly there. So we launched in January, and we still haven't landed. We'll land June 5th here in the US. That's because we take a low energy orbit. And the intent of that is to minimize the amount of fuel we want to take with us and maximize the amount of payload capacity we can have. So as many customers as we can. So we did a bunch of phasing loops, and then we did a lunar flyby. I think we're the first commercial company to have done a lunar flyby. Like M1, we went pretty far. I think on M1, we went to 1.4 million kilometers away from Earth, this time 1.1. And we're now on our way back, and we'll meet the moon probably May-ish to do the lunar insertion, and then land June 5th. The flight dynamics for this was done in-house also, which is pretty cool. Then a little focus point on Luxembourg. So this rover here is a real mock-up of our flight rover. The flight rover is in the video. Again, Sojourner-like in terms of size, half the mass. Sojourner was 10 kilograms. This rover is 5 kilograms with payloads. Roughly same performance in terms of distance we expect to travel, a number of days. You can see we're integrating a scoop here, and you can see the scoop in the front of the picture. That scoop is there because we have a contract with NASA to collect lunar regolith, so lunar soil. It's a symbolic contract. We are going to collect lunar regolith and then take pictures of it, and then we'll get a check from NASA for $5,000 as a thank you. That contract was initiated by NASA, I think, to test the various regulations that are around space resources and commercialization of space resources. So it was awarded to companies in the US, in Luxembourg, ourselves, and Japan, our mother company, to test the regulations in the US, Luxembourg, and Japan. I think the US passed their law on commercialization of space resources in 2016. Luxembourg was the second country in the world to do that in 2017. So we're the first entity to have received an authorization from the government of Luxembourg to do this activity. We had to be authorized before the launch. We got the authorization to collect regolith and sell it to NASA. So that's the real value, right? We're not doing this for the $5,000. We're doing this to test the regulations and then enable all the discussions that will follow. Interestingly, also in the spirit of new space, what this contract gave us is the ability to engage with the mining industry and tell them, look, we have this historical transaction we're about to do with NASA around space resources. And that got us the attention of a mining company in Sweden, Epiroc, who's been in business for more than 100 years. They do equipment that would not fit in this room to drill underground. They basically drill tunnels for the mining industry, so the equipment provider. So maybe 20 metric ton is the standard product size. And for us, they're doing a scoop of 200 grams. So again, I think it's very, to me, exciting to see this engagement from a terrestrial company, which before we talked to them had no space activity at all. Now they're doing this scoop, mostly for marketing PR purposes, but also because it's their business model, right? They do extraction tooling, and that's exactly what they're doing for us. So now we can talk about, okay, how do we scale this up in the future? That's just this is not the moon, this is our lunar yard in Luxembourg, just to show you what we aim to be doing in June timeframe after landing. Collect some regolith, and then hold it until somebody from NASA shows up in the future. So takeaways from there, I think when I present iSpace Europe for people who visit, I think we pack a lot of punch in very small things. We have a very small team. We do small robots, but I think big impact. That rover you saw is the first rover ever launched from Europe. Europe has been working on ExoMars, but unfortunately ExoMars is still looking for a ride 20 years later. So our rover, which we started roughly 2.5 years ago, is the first rover made in Europe that launched, which is pretty cool, from in terms of impact. It could be the first commercial or private rover to drive on the moon, which is also really cool. And I hope to be, the first company to do this transaction of a space resource between a private company and NASA, and see, okay, what do we do next? How do we scale this from a regulation perspective, technology perspective, business perspective? So, yeah, small, few people, small robots, but big impact. Yeah. So this leads me to, the theme of today, which was glimpses of the future, if I recall correctly. I think through iSpace and what I just showed, I think you can see some glimpses of future. Big global momentum for lunar exploration. Just as an example, Artemis Accords, 54 members. Artemis Accords started in 2020 with, I think, maybe a handful of members. Luxembourg was one of them. 54 today. I mean, it's just amazing. And when you see the list of countries, it's truly global. And what I like is, now, after 8 years at iSpace, the question is no longer, okay, can we demonstrate lunar landings commercially? It's what do we do next? Okay, what comes after? Okay, we see the energy as maybe the next big challenge, like how do we have available power on the moon and so on. So what kind of value chains and businesses can we create around that? Same thing for construction, same thing for telecommunications. So now the questions are, what are the right opportunities downstream of transportation now that we've opened access to the moon? That's very exciting. And lunar exploration is no longer about science and exploration. Of course, that's a big part of it, but there's room for artists, there's room for entrepreneurs. That also, I think, is a very healthy sign. So what I look forward to, in the next 5 years or so is I would be really excited to have, business-to-business transactions on the moon, like having 2 operators on the moon exchanging a service, maybe with a smart contract or whatever. And now it's not about Earth to moon, right? It's really about, okay, we have 2 entities on the moon, just constantly, trading services, exchanging money, and so on. I think that would be really exciting. Aggregating infrastructure. So now we're doing mostly like one-off missions. We're going here, we're going there. Can we start now talking about aggregation, infrastructure, logistics? And, going from moon back to Earth. One of the early business cases for the lunar economy was the ULA refueling, I think, a study that came out a few years ago. It's still valid today. Today we see also several startups, Interloon, Magna Petra, looking at helium-3 for quantum computing, for fusion. So now again, a moon to Earth, value transfer, which is very exciting. So what it means for you in terms of undergrads or grad students at MIT, I think again you should feel very lucky for where you are. And I like this. I don't know who mentioned this first, but like how luck is preparation meets opportunity. I think there's a lot of opportunities, as we discussed in space exploration, just space in general. And you're already quite prepared. You're at MIT, so I think you have a good head start. And the question for you, I think, is how do you maximize your preparation for the opportunities that you want to take on in the near future? And my advice there is, especially if you're in engineering, being an expert in engineering is great. That's the content, but you should really, as much as possible, try to absorb the context in which you operate. What I mean by this is, if you ever join a space startup, you'll realize engineering is just part of what you do. Even if you're supposed to be engineer X, you'll do a lot more. You're going to get called by your business team to support a conversation with a customer. You're going to have to prepare an NDA with a partner. So if you don't know what an NDA is, go talk to the MIT legal department. I don't know what an NDA is. What does it do? I think that's what the curiosity you need to develop and think about the whole business, not just your field of expertise, but now is the time to start understanding like how does a company, how does a public entity work. And I think you can do this at MIT or AeroAstro or SSR or whatever. Everybody has a legal department, has a promotion department. see what they do. What processes do they use? What's important? What's the terminology? And you'll be much better prepared to be in a startup environment where things are on fire all the time, and there's very little time to learn. Think global. I think that's a big thing I mentioned today. It's not just about the US anymore. And it's true for if you want to create a company. You can create your company outside the US. I mentioned Luxembourg is a good opportunity. You don't have to create a company. You can join also existing companies outside the US that do really cool things. And if you're a non-US citizen, at AeroAstro, fortunately, I think it's the same thing that happened to most of my friends 20 years ago. You're going to have to leave to work somewhere else. Now the cool thing is you can leave and still work in space exploration in a cool company. That's why we have close to 30 nationalities at iSpace, is because there's not that many places today where you can do space exploration as a non-US citizen. So think about us for that. I like to watch old videos about the computer industry in the early 80s, because to me that's a bit similar to what we do now. Also, the early internet videos are interesting because everybody could feel the excitement about computers and the internet, but it couldn't really articulate where things were going. And so in hindsight, it's interesting to see that. And so one thought to conclude here is, if we're at this point of time where we can feel the excitement about lunar space and all this, what is this vision? Where are we heading? And what kind of bold ideas can you come up with? Bill Gates and Paul Allen, the founders of Microsoft, early 1980s, so really, really early in the computer industry, said, okay, we're going to put a computer on every desk, every room. And that was a crazy, bold statement back then. What is the equivalent today? I think to me, it's an open question. You could say, well, every business on Earth is going to have a lunar division. Or, everybody on Earth will have a cousin who lives on the moon. It sounds stupid and funny today, but I think that's how this statement sounded in 1980. So I think that's a valuable thought exercise to do. And I think I'll conclude with that. So hopefully that was interesting. Thank you for your attention. And we can have a few questions. Take your count time, or?
We have one or two questions we have, yes.
Are there microphones or other questions?
Come on, you're a tough guy. Let's get a question.
I thought,
yes.
Yes, thank you, Dave.
Very much good to see you. Can you give us an assessment of the business case for lunar versus low Earth orbit?
Yes, so there's a point I like to make about this exact parallel is I often hear people talk about space debris removal, in-space manufacturing, satellite servicing as the next emerging markets for space, and then the moon comes next. The counterpoint I like to make when I hear this is if you stack up all the contracts that we have at iSpace, plus the ones from Intuitive Machines, other companies, and so on. Like for every mission, we have about maybe 5 or more contracts. So I don't know how many we have for iSpace, but a couple dozen, plus Intuitive Machines, plus the other lunar companies. I think that's more contracts that you can find for space debris removal, for sure, in space manufacturing, satellite servicing, and so on. So to me, it's the same point I was trying to make with space tourism. It might seem like these are the next things you want to develop, the easier markets. You understand the business a little more. But the fact is, I think, is the lunar business is developing much faster. Maybe not in terms of total revenue. I don't know the numbers there, but in terms of engagement, customer engagement, contracts, and so on, I think the moon is already ahead of the next LEO markets. Does that answer your question? Or?
We got it right.
Okay. Thank you.